This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A long time ago, 2014, I think, I wanted to branch this podcast out. The first year or 2 years, I spoke only to traders, Wall Street people. One of the first people that I reached out to try and expand this podcast was the behavioral psychologist, Dan Ariely at Duke. I had to wait till his semester was over, but I did get him on. And getting him on was one of the ways that helped me to get Daniel Kahneman on. And once I had Kahneman on, everybody wanted to come on. Or maybe they didn't want to come on because of Kahneman, but they were scared not to. My guest today connects back to Dan Ariely because Jeff Kreisler has a book that he has written with Dan called Dollars and Cents: How We Misthink Money and How to Spend Smarter. It doesn't make a difference who we are, what our age, our experience. We screw up our understanding of money in our day-to-day life nonstop, 24/7. And today with Jeff, we go down the dusty trail of the examples, the chit-chat, the back and forth, to try and leave you guys, the audience, with something interesting and those takeaways that can help you to save a little and make a little. Because in this crazy time that we're living in right now, we can all use a little more money. So Jeff, I prepared for you by, going through your book and all that kind of stuff. But I did a little odd preparation today. I really wasn't preparation, but I was watching episode 9 of Better Call Saul, literally right before this episode. And I can't watch that show without thinking about Bob Odenkirk and the classic Curb Your Enthusiasm episode, which I'm guessing you've probably seen. But anyways, complete tangent. That was my preparation of getting on the horn with you today.
I'm honored to be in such austere company. As a meth dealer, a lawyer, and Curb Your Enthusiasm.
When I started this podcast in 2012, it was all trading guests. And your co-author was the first non-trading guest for me to ask to come on. I had to wait for his semester to be over at Duke, but he was the first one to come on. 2014, I think.
Well, it makes sense. What Dan studies and what I've had the pleasure of being involved with for a while now is human irrationality and behavior. And some drug dealers and drug use and comedy, they're all sort of human irrationality that's not too far removed from financial decision making. Even if the people that consider themselves or ourselves experts in money like to think it's all rational, it's really not always the case.
Well, and that kind of leads us to today. And I just wonder, how do you feel after working in the behavioral space, bringing all these cool insights together? Is right now just one of the most crazy petri dishes, one of the most crazy experiments to look at and just watch humans and money and behavior, and it's all in one kind of massive, incredible whirl blender?
Yeah, I think maybe the term petri dish is the most accurate, although it sounds a little dirty, because I think what's going on now, it is all of the factors that normally make us behave irrationally are just really heightened. I think we're seeing the extreme outcome of a lot of what we do in a day-to-day basis. Most of our decision-making, financial and otherwise, is often driven by an underlying sense of uncertainty. And when we're uncertain about what the right choice is, we tend to fall for emotional or psychological little nudges or traps or principles or heuristics. I'm sure your listeners have heard different terms for it. Right now, we're living in sort of extreme uncertainty and extreme stress. The sort of drivers that make us feel like we need that easy answer or that we're going to fall for that easy decision cue, those are even stronger. So what we're seeing is a lot of, again, that normal irrational behavior but heightened. I mean, the classic example is, at least here, is the hoarding of toilet paper. That's not rational, but if you try to unpack that a little bit, you can see that there are behaviors and drivers there that we can witness even in the best of most normal times.
I'm not even sure how the toilet paper one took off.
I have a few theories, and of course, at this point, things are mostly theories because people haven't broken down the data if they ever will. I think there are a few things that we're seeing. One is social proof. Basically, one of the big principles of behavioral science is that when people are unsure what to do, they take their cues from what those around them are doing, or even more specifically, like what they think those around them are doing. We suddenly see on the news that people are hoarding toilet paper and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and we rush out to get it. So once it's started, we feel like we have to go and take part of that or we're going to miss out. My pop psychology theory about why toilet paper in particular fell into the hoarding world is we want a sense of control in this completely uncertain and out of control time. As humans, the one thing we can't control, and I speak as someone trying to potty train a 3-year-old right now, is using the restroom. Our body will do that no matter what we try to stop it from doing. Toilet paper is sort of a sense of trying to get control over that one uncontrollable thing. So again, that's a little pop psychology, not founded in deep research, but why it's toilet paper seems to have a little back to the most basic of human nature aspect to me.
I feel very fortunate. I don't say this as a brag or that I'm cocky, but calling you from Asia today, I happen to have a Japanese toilet in the house. So that I kind of just sat back with a little bit of a grin of like, oh, all you Americans grabbing your toilet paper.
Exactly.
What's interesting about that point you make, though, is that it probably could have been something if the news would have featured bleach, for example. It could have been a bleach run.
Well, certainly hand sanitizers were amongst the thing being hoarded. That makes a little more sense because that's actually practical now. But even that, there was no indication that the supplies of anything are going to run out. To the extent that it was about that social proof and about how people take their cues from what they see others doing, yeah, people could have said, oh my God, they're hoarding broccoli. People might have done that.
A lot of people are going to be familiar with your co-author, Dan Ariely, and they're going to be familiar with his work. How did you guys connect? And even taking it a step before that, how did you get into this headspace where this became a passion of yours?
And I'll preface by saying I will ask people in this field often a similar question, and I delude myself by calling them origin stories, like superheroes, because this whole field of behavioral economics, behavioral science is relatively new. There's few people above the age of 30 who are able to study this like in school and then go right into it as a profession. It's really only blown up in the last 10 or so years. So that's my long preface, and here's my hopefully not longer answer, but I'll try to keep it tight. My background was in comedy, particularly in satire as a stand-up and a writer. And I wrote a book in 2009, a satire called Get Rich Cheating. It was all about steroids and the stock market and companies that would collapse and their CEO would get a $40 million golden parachute. And it was about politics. And yeah, it was about Donald Trump was well represented 11 years ago. And it was a satire, but it was based upon real research that I'd done. And basically the underlying theory was that money messes with our heads. I did this without any exposure to the world of behavioral economics. It just wasn't something I was aware of. But I looked at what I saw all these scandals were about. Dan invited me. He got a copy of the book. And at the time he was working on his book about dishonesty. And he invited me to lecture to his students at Duke University, his graduate business students, and to do so in character. The book that I wrote was a satire. It was like Stephen Colbert. And I went and I did these sort of Tony Robbins-esque empowerment things where my underlying message was cheat to get rich, right? Live the life you want. And I would go and I'd lecture to his class. And in character, I would basically say, cost-benefit analysis. You guys are economically minded. There's no cost. No one gets caught and put in jail, but you make millions. I would go on, and inevitably, about 20 minutes or so, someone would raise their hand and say, are you full of it? What are you talking about? And I'd put it to the class, like, who thinks I'm legitimate? And there was always some small little chunk of the class that agreed, yeah, this is what you should do. You should just make money. For me, it was a light bulb moment, both to see that reaction from business students at a leading school, and then to learn more about Dan's work and the work of his peers, and that sort of everything I'd sort of intuited, there was a real science to it. For better or worse, I come from a background where I will rely upon scientific findings to guide the validity of opinions that I have. I know that nowadays that seems a little crazy. You should just start a Twitter feed and then you're an authority. But it was this moment for me where it sort of like combined everything I'd always been working on, not just this cheating stuff, but I'd gone to law school, I'd gone to Princeton and studied economics and politics, and none of the traditional decision-making stuff stuck for me because it wasn't how I felt humans really lived. Yeah, on an aggregate, macroeconomics works, you're supply and demand and all that, but on a day-to-day, I don't go to the supermarket and when the milk is 20 cents more than it is next door, go to the store next door. I am sitting in there texting somebody and I'm in a hurry and my car is running out of gas. Like I'm full of stress and uncertainty. And that's what behavioral economics I discovered, what it reflected is human reality, human decision making, whether it was about money or other things in the real world. I was just smitten with it and fascinated. And Dan, for whatever reason, sort of liked something about me. We worked on some small projects, various little fun things. And then at one point I remember we were literally having a glass of wine. I can remember the place, the restaurant in Durham. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember where it was. He just said, "You want to help me with a book?" And I said, "Sure." It was this book, Dollars and Cents. It took me, I should say, far too long to write it, but I kind of gave myself a crash degree in behavioral economics. I read everything that was out there, and Dan and I talked a lot about it, and it's had a good reception, and it's out around the world, so I like to think it's done pretty well. Here I am.
We talk about Dan, and I bring up asking him on all those years ago, and when I asked him on, and I was waiting for him to come on, I asked a guy who had won the Nobel Prize, Vernon Smith. So I finally got Dan on, I had Vernon Smith on, so I had a little ammo now, and I was like, so then I went to Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman listened to the episodes, and he's like, "Oh, those are good, I'll come on." Once Daniel came on this show, then I was like sending out emails to everybody, and I think everybody was literally scared to say no because I had had a chance to interview Daniel Kahneman. So that was my behavioral thrust. And I think since then, I have so enjoyed just finding every psychologist I possibly can to come on the show, because I find they usually have got some angle, some niche, some perspective that just tells us something about ourselves.
Well, I certainly have found, for my particular background coming from the world of comedy, that there's like a yin-yang relationship. You know, the comedian looks at human behavior and says, "Hey, did you ever notice people do this crazy thing?" And the behavioral scientist is, "Yeah, and this is why." I've just loved that way it fits together. Perhaps related to that is that I have also found that the people working in this field are really great people. I think I always thought this for the most part about comedians, and I think it's even more true for behavioral science professionals, that if your job is to basically observe human nature and try to figure out what's going on, it's kind of hard to come out of that and be a jerk. It's one of the pleasures that I've had. I mean, even your story just about how Kahneman gave a listen, I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." That's great. I think people of similar stature in other fields might not be so amenable. So I'm not surprised by your story, and I'm glad you went down that road.
It's funny, we're bringing up comedy, and I'm thinking about Seinfeld. I guess since his primary show went off the air, gosh, how much content has he had a chance to mine that would have been in Seinfeld episodes if the show went on forever? I mean, he could have just done, and you watch the comedians in Cars, he's still as fresh as ever.
Yeah. Well, you don't lose your perspective. There's an argument to be made that your view of the world may stick in a certain place. In other words, when they talk about PC culture, certain comedians feel like they can't talk now. I disagree with that. That's a long conversation. But I think what happens is your view as a person maybe is stuck in when you're 20 and 30 and you're forming that. But your ability to think as a comedian or as a scientist or as a financial professional, however you view the world and then reinterpret it, doesn't change. I'm not sure if that was totally clear. I'm saying some people may think the world is still the 80s, but they're still able to process as they would.
Yeah, I think a guy like Seinfeld, he's got a skill set where it just allows him to walk into any environment, see what's going on, and see it at a level that maybe we all get too caught up in or whatever, and he sees it at its base level.
There's a great, I have no idea what the name is, and maybe we can look it up and share it with your listeners, but the great Twitter feed that's basically like modern Seinfeld or something like that, and it's somebody basically does the idea that you're saying, like writes up versions of what a Seinfeld episode would be based upon Jerry, my iPhone wiped, or I don't, you know, I'm not brilliant enough to come up with what it is, but
toilet paper they would have done something with toilet paper that would have been brilliant for sure.
Yeah. Something about some of it being on Kramer's shoe, and he got an idea for a business about shoe paper, and I don't know.
What's the comedian thing? I guess I saw a bunch of Second City players talking about this. It's the How do you do it? It's or and that kind of, you always just take it the step that add and go.
Yeah. Yes, and.
Yes, and.
And this is particularly in improv comedy and sketch comedy, maybe more than stand-up. But it's a great philosophy. I mean, it's something that sort of infiltrated the business world as people have tried to, sometimes the improv people sell to businesses, but just the idea of building on stuff. Instead of saying no to an idea, saying yes. And the next step is, and it's certainly a great way, a great thought process. You don't have to commit your millions of dollars of corporate resources to something on that basis, but you can at least have a conversation being open-minded. It's a very useful tool, a useful perspective.
Let me throw something out that I saw in your book, which struck me, it hit home so on the money. And the notion of, if you're planning, well, how'd you say it? When you first start dating, talk about what the wedding planning will look like, imagining that you're getting married. It hit me because I had one relationship fall apart at that exact moment at the wedding planning. Explain that. Explain it. I didn't explain it very good. You explain it.
Well, I mean, the example was a little tongue-in-cheek, but the point was, think about when you're going to be in situations that are the most stressful. It's almost like we at the top of the show, like right now, this moment around the world is the most stressful. And so our human flaws and irrationalities and our emotions and all these things that lead us to do silly things are more exposed. And the same is true, we found, about wedding planning. Wedding planning can be a particularly stressful moment at a time when you're supposedly celebrating a beautiful emotion of love. It's a time when you've got all sorts of pressures, whether it's from family or financial, and you've also, again, trying to deal with, we're doing this to celebrate our love, and there's just so many things going on. I believe all of that sort of strips away and gets to right to like who that person is, that your potential spouse and yourself. You find out who you are in stress because it's just exposed. It's useful because throughout your life and relationship, you'll have moments, maybe not as intense, but you'll have moments where it's going to come down to what you really are at your basic level, your human nature. And it's important to know. I look at that example for my own self. Married, we've got a couple kids, everything's great, but there's certainly stressful times. Like during Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, we were living in Hoboken, New Jersey, sort of the eye of the storm. And I can distinctly remember like that moment when it was like, oh my gosh, we have to decide what we're doing. Luckily, we liked each other and could communicate, but we were very raw and emotional. Yeah, I think thinking about wedding planning is one good thing. I wouldn't really recommend it on the first date. You'll miss out on a lot of fun first dates, but it is something to think about. Those types of like, what's this person going to be like when I need him or her the most?
Let me take it really big picture for a moment. Maybe I should have done this at the top. Money. So it's a two-part question. What is money to you, and what really is money in the system, so to speak? And are they the same thing?
They're not the same thing. And I would say the first question of what is it to me is, a little particularly personal, but I can speak to my own self as well as the general people. Money is basically an ends to a means. I don't want to be too textbook about it, but it represents the value of goods and services, and it enables us to trade those products and services. Money is incredibly amazing. Like, I used to be a very money is the root of all evil guy, and I believe money still does cause a little evil. But I've come to see the real value in the money in its ability to basically allow society to blossom, allow people to blossom. If you think about what the features of money is, it's general. You can use money for any product or service. That wasn't always the case in the barter society, which is an alternative. Money is divisible. You can break up $10 into 10 ones or a bunch of quarters. You couldn't do that. If you're someone who makes couches and you want some chickens from someone in a barter society and your chickens are worth half a couch, you can't break your couch in half. Money is fungible. Any $10 is the same as any other $10. You don't need a certain $10 bill or a certain check. And so like our account of money and the money that we have is broad. It isn't just defined by specific items of money. And money, most importantly, is storable. You can invest money. You can save it. Couldn't do that with goods or services. Like if you made your living as a comedian or a court jester, let's say, in a barter day, like once you stop being able to do that, you were in trouble. Or if you had crops that you grew, those would spoil. So all of these elements of money have allowed people to specialize and become lawyers and doctors and Kardashians. They've allowed us to have society grow, and it's amazing. The problem is that all those things that make money really special are also part of what make it really hard to think about. I won't go off on too much of a tangent. That sort of leads to why it's so hard to make financial decisions, why there's always this uncertainty, because there's all these options, all these opportunity costs. You can do so many things with money that deciding whether or not you're doing the right thing, deciding what the value of a choice is an impossible challenge. So we fall for these traps and biases and nudges and heuristics. So broadly speaking, I didn't give you the textbook 101 answer on what is money, but that's sort of why money, I believe, is so impactful.
You can go at this next question from a behavioral perspective, the research perspective, if one exists. But I'm curious, I'm going to guess you're coming at life at this point in your life from an entrepreneurial perspective. Is that accurate or not?
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. I mean, I think I've consciously or not always been there. I don't want to get too therapist couch with you, but I'm the youngest kid in a successful family, and I went to law school and I decided I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't want to take this route, this successful path that's been handed to me on a platter. I want to go be a stand-up comedian. I want to jump into a field where the success rate is 0.001%.
No safety net.
Exactly. And my background doesn't matter. I was lucky to perform with Robin Williams a handful of times. And I remember the first time I saw him walk on stage, for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, he could do no wrong. Robin Williams, amazing. But then after those 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, he had to be funny. It didn't matter who he was. It was all about the quality of his content and his skills. I came from a fairly fortunate / privileged background. Like, we weren't crazy rich people or anything, but like, I went to a private school. I went to Princeton. I went to a top law school. Like, I was around a world where things were just sort of handed to you if you were smart and worked hard. And to see that sort of raw, you got to earn it, was like just inspiring to me. And again, I'll get off the therapist couch, but that idea, you have to earn it, I think is a particularly entrepreneurial driver, or at least it was for me. Being a comedian was always essentially about running my own business of me, whether it was trying to get on stage or trying to find other projects that were related to my skill set to pay the bills. I wrote a column for Jim Cramer's TheStreet.com. It was a humor column about business. No one was doing that. And I just sort of like, hey, here's a cool idea. And I found a way to make it happen. Even my first book. I've always been an entrepreneurial mindset. I think the last 4 or 5 years, it has accelerated a bit for me because of the more tangible sort of commercial applicability of behavioral science and behavioral economics. It's not just me trying to find different ways of selling funny. I have information and ideas that are going to help individuals and organizations. As a bonus, I can deliver it in an entertaining and engaging way. Book came out. I do talks. I run a website called People Science, which is all about applied behavioral science, not just financial decision making, but all throughout the marketplace.
There's two sides of the ledger. There's those folks that say, I'm going to go through life looking for a job. I'm going to have somebody cut me a check. Then there's the other side of the ledger where it's someone who says, I'm going to go kill it and eat it. And those things are going to look at the content that you guys have put together, I think, in a very different way. I just imagine it's going to be very different. And I think it could be difficult to write to both audiences in some ways.
I think you're right that people approach it differently. What I take some pride in, and maybe pride is the wrong word, delusion should be there, is that what we try to do in the book and what I try to do in a lot of different contexts is say human behavior at the very core, like the things that motivate us subconsciously, it's the same for everyone. But everyone has a different context and everyone has the weights and balances are different. Somebody may be more affected by sale prices than by name brands. Somebody may be more affected by scarcity than they are by that social pressure. We can't universally say that everybody is affected the same by these biases and these principles, but they're all under the surface. I think that in what you just described, that same sort of perspective can apply, in that an entrepreneur might look at these sort of biases and more like, oh, here's an opportunity for me to make better decisions for my business or to interact with my customers in a new way. Whereas an individual who is more in a steady, like, I get a paycheck every month and my issue is that I spend too much on shoes or on restaurants, may look at it from more a perspective like, how is it affecting me? What am I doing wrong? I think the forces are the same, but I hope that both audiences can get something out of it.
Well, here's an example from your work, something that I took away from my MBA program. I did not take much away from my MBA program, but two concepts, and I've been telling this to people for 20 years. I said, look, skip the MBA, just find out what a sunk cost is and find out what an opportunity cost is, and you got 99% in the MBA.
I won't prescribe that to your listeners and endorse it, but I think on the surface, that's accurate. I mean, so much of decision-making about anything, whether it's your business or your life, is thinking about those sorts of things. What's the alternative decision? That's the opportunity cost. What else could I be doing with this money? Then the sunk cost, I think, is a huge thing for entrepreneurial people, people that have the purse strings, because you just get so attached to something that it's hard to leave it. Even when you realize it's a bad idea, oh my God, I've already spent $900,000 on it. I might as well spend the next $100,000, even though you know it's all going to go to waste. And look, that's going back to the dinner date, marriage planning question. That's true in relationships and the rest of our life too. Often we make a decision based upon the sunk cost, what we've put into it, not thinking forward.
Why did you hedge a little bit when I asked the question? Because it sounded like you wanted to agree with me, but you didn't really want to agree with me, because if you agreed with me, it wouldn't sound good.
I hedge because I hesitate to give people advice on what to do.
Gotcha.
While I might say, okay, that's a fair, and I do think that's a fair assessment, some people need to go to business school for 2 years and have that message pounded into them for 2 years, and maybe financially they can afford to do so. And there's other benefits. I hesitate because I'm sure somewhere out there's some young person all doe-eyed listening to this, waiting for me to tell them what to do about their business school decision.
All doe-eyed. Someone's going to have to read between the lines on that. All doe-eyed. That's not a hedge. That's not a hedge there. Listen, so here's a really interesting thing to me right now. We have this COVID hit. The global economies collapse overnight. And there's a lot of arguments about whether, okay, were we already in a massive bubble after 10 years? So COVID hitting at the top of a bubble, maybe not, maybe. But nonetheless, it's hit. We've locked the economies down, massive unemployment. And what's really amazing to me, and I want you to kind of take the behavioral vantage on this, people have no money. People have no savings. There's no rainy day. There's no grandma behavior at all anymore. It's just gone. And the moral hazard is just brutal in the sense that, I mean, after the real estate crisis, the Fed stepped after the dot-com crisis, then after the real estate crisis, now after this crisis, the Fed just keeps stepping in and raining down. I mean, so it's going to kind of leave us in a way where behavior is going to have a hard time ever getting to where you guys are pushing us to be.
I often will say to leave people with a framework for broadly approaching decisions about particularly financial decisions, I suggest trying to make the consequences of your decisions a lot more tangible. If you think about the issue of self-control or a lack thereof, whether it's about saving for retirement or going into debt or eating cake or not exercising, self-control, the problem there is that we don't connect to our future selves like we do our present selves. Like our present self, what we want right now, that cake or that not exercising or spending, has a strong emotional pull right now. But our future selves, the person that faces the ramifications, the consequence of that decision, studies show that we think of our future selves as a completely different person. We're not emotionally connected to that person or organization or whatever it may be. We have a hard time planning for the future. And one way to sort of bridge that gap is to try to make that future consequence more tangible, more specific. There are tons of studies from the people that use sort of virtual reality interacting with an older version of yourself, and people then save more, right? Or to just making your retirement a lot more concrete, right? Not how much money do you want, but where are you going to live, and how's your health, and are your kids going to visit, and all that. All the ways that we make the future more concrete can help us make better decisions about the future. There are other ways, like you can make things sort of default and automatic. An automatic withdrawal from your 401k prevents you from making those decisions every paycheck.
It's about the heuristics. It's about the hacks of one's life to take these smart things that you guys have figured out or categorized and apply them.
Right, exactly. As you're saying, this idea, the moral hazard, or the fact that when we, and I'll use the we broadly, and we could spend time drilling down if we means individuals, corporations, governments, or banks, whatever it may be, when we don't face the negative consequences of our actions, then it makes it even harder going forward to make decisions in regards to those consequences. If we go into massive debt, we're supposed to be in the moment thinking, I shouldn't go into debt because in the future I'll end up bankrupt in debtor's jail. But that future now we're seeing actually doesn't even happen. There's almost no reason whatsoever to try to behave well for our future selves. It is what you're describing, a giant challenge when people feel like, oh, even if we go into $20 trillion of debt, or even if everything collapses, we'll still get bailed out. Now, I'm not going to derail this too much. There's a question about like who the we is. Again, is it corporations and banks? Is it individuals? Is it governments?
It's got to be a little bit of everybody. I mean, for example, here's one of these things you talk about, the kind of the rainy day thing. It's like, I'm just going to pick on the airlines for a second, but I looked at some of the numbers and it was like, I mean, the amount of money they spent goosing their share prices with buybacks. And then all of a sudden, something terrible happens. It's happening to everybody, but not prepared for it in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I'm tempted to say there should be a rule. I mean, I don't want to get too into what's controlling, but you have to have a certain amount of funds on reserve to withstand something. It's one thing if you're telling that to individuals who, for whatever circumstances, they have challenge paying bills. But to large corporations where you're providing them that essentially through the tax cuts, you're giving them all this money, say, okay, you can do this, but you have to carve out 5% to be in whatever, your emergency global crisis fund. That would seem to just, whether you're told that you have to do that or just common sense tells you you should. The challenge is what you're describing here. Like that common sense isn't going to tell you I should put aside 5% rainy day fund, because common sense is telling me that if it all falls apart, someone is going to bail me out. That's where it all gets hazy. I mean, what's interesting about the timing of this is I had on People Science, this website, we had published a little bit ago an article about some studies regarding financial precarity, the sense of precariousness. It looked at this study about workplace safety and productivity for folks that were financially stressed, trying to show that financial stress had the same impact as other health and impacts, stuff like that. And underlying all that was this thing you always hear, 40% of Americans can't take a $400 unexpected cost. What we found in unpacking it is that it's not just people that don't make a lot of money. When you say that 40%, $400, we tend to go to a place where like, oh, the minimum wage earners or the folks that are barely getting by or that aren't making a lot of money. But this sense of precarity, this sense of I don't know what to do, and if something changes, I'm screwed, is up and down the income ladder. Not at the 1%, one percenters, but pretty close. The anecdote for me is I have someone who was an executive at a TV network in New York City, working there for 13 years, the last 7 or 8 of which he was making 300 plus grand a year, and he lost his job and he freaked out. He's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. If you're making $300,000 for 7 or 8 years, you should be able to provide yourself a cushion. But he wasn't able to. Just like that's not how he lived. It shows that this sense of like, we don't have money or we don't know what to do is up and down the income ladder. Obviously, that's an anecdote and I don't have the data, but I would think most people making that type of money do have a cushion. But like you said, what this is exposing is that nobody has money.
There are plenty of people across America that have got houses worth $1 million and $1 million mortgage.
Yeah.
And you know what's really funny too is when I'm outside the country, a lot of people really don't understand this about America. Outsiders to America, they don't really get how leveraged America is. I mean, you look at the folks out there that are buying a $25,000 car and they're taking out a $40,000 loan. I tell that to people outside of America. Some of them just look at me and it doesn't even register what the whole point is. You have to sit there and kind of map it out like, yeah, they're buying the car for 25, they're taking an extra 15 to go buy all the furniture for their house. And people just look at you like, is this nuts?
Donald Trump is the perfect president in some ways. He's leveraged upon leverage upon leverage upon leverage.
Absolutely.
That is what our economy is. And broadly speaking, it's debt driven. I mean, I was on a call yesterday and I won't get into details because it doesn't really matter, but someone was talking about how the Fed sort of playbook for when there's economic trouble looming, their first move is always lowering rates. And we were explaining how this made it so borrowing was easier. And I just had to like sort of put the sidebar on and I'd say like, there is something to note before we just move on, how borrowing is what we consider to be the engine of our economy. It does make sense on some level, right? If a company can open a factory by borrowing money and that provides jobs, that's great. But it is sort of American human nature to think about borrowing to make the big things as opposed to actually some other way of financing it.
All these topics that we're talking about, these different tangents that I'm taking you on, everyone just has to sit back and look at it from the behavioral lens. Wherever they are at, wherever their friends and associates are at. And it's all just one big, great analysis for us to take a peek at. Let me take you to one of these classic examples that you guys have written about, which I love. We go to the store. Okay, if we go to a 7-Eleven, we're willing to pay a little bit more for convenience or whatever. But generally, we know what we want to pay for a bottle of water or a can of Coke. However, if we go to the swanky Shangri-La Hotel, or we end up on some resort on some island somewhere, and we go into the hotel room and we start pounding the Fiji bottle of water, and then we look fine print and they're charging us $20 for a bottle of water. Sometimes, what do? You can't really do anything. You just kind of grin and bear it.
It shows how our sense of how we value things, what we think something is worth, is sort of a mirage in a little bit. We've decided a Coke is worth $1, but that's in our normal context, in our normal existence. But like you said, then you go to that resort and it's $10, or you go somewhere else. The way that you handle that is first by being aware. I think anything you can be aware, and then at least stopping and thinking and saying, okay, is my experience, like you said, almost like the 7-Eleven, I'm paying for the convenience, or I'm paying for this here. I'm in my hotel room. Is it worth $20 to have a Fiji bottle of water, or should I just go over to the faucet and drink the tap water because it's not that different? I think if you start to be aware of what's happening, you can make better decisions. Obviously, it's hard to say we're trapped if you're talking about Fiji water in a resort. You don't have a lot of other options, so you can't do a comparison shopping, but you can certainly think about your decisions and whether or not having that Fiji water really aligns with what's important and what your values are. And it's interesting that I sort of stumbled upon the idea because there was a recent study that I think is relevant to this conversation as well as like the broader, living in coronavirus times. It was by the Decision Lab in partnership with a bank. I want to say it was with Discover. So it doesn't matter. I can find the details and send you a link. But they were looking at financial stress and financial irrational decision making. And they found that when people took a big picture view, when they stopped and whatever your metaphor, took a 30,000-foot view, took a big picture, a long term, whatever that is, when they took that broader perspective, they were able to make better decisions because it grounded them a little more. And one of the things that they looked at was when you connect to your sort of personal identity and values in those moments, that helps guide us. Do I need a $25,000 car right now? Do I need Fiji water? Is that about who I am? And I've been fascinated, again, a little tangent, I'll come back, broadly speaking about the power of identity generally in decision making, and some cool new studies about the workplace, about having professional purpose, how that can motivate us and provide incentives, because our identity is something that it's not measurable in dollars and cents, but it's actually a really strong driver. And when we are in tough decision-making moments, if we're able to stop and think, how does this decision, how does this purchase, how does this lack of purchase, this saving, how does it connect to what matters to me? We'll find ourselves making better choices. How does it connect to me to nudge some old lady out of the way so I can grab the last thing of toilet paper? Is that who I am? You will stop and realize, no, it's not. Again, that's sort of a luxury that some may find themselves being able to take that perspective. But when we can, it helps. I realize I went off on a broad tangent from the hotel room water, but
I'll bring it back to that as a quick side note. My hack, this might not work for an isolated resort, but for most hotels, if you go down to the lobby, ask the bellman, where's the convenience store? You're going to save yourself a lot of money. Go stock up on everything you want for that night or nights, and don't give the hotel the money because they're just going to bleed you dry. Hey, let me take you to another broad kind of area. One of my favorite places. I'm not a gambler at all. In fact, I've been to Vegas so many times I can't count. I've never spent a dime in Vegas on gambling, just have no interest. But when you think about Vegas, when you put the behavioral spotlight on Vegas, what are 3 things that you really take away that might be illustrative of how we go about doing things the wrong way? I think Vegas just seems like a great test case for tearing apart human behavior.
it is. In fact, maybe this is why I thought of the reference. We open our book with sort of a tale of someone wandering through a casino. I personally have always been fascinated by casinos. I tend to go and I gamble a little bit and I lose it quickly. And then I sit and observe human behavior. Vegas is sort of on one level, it's the ultimate hotel room with a $10 bottle of water because it takes us out of any reality we're used to. You go to a casino, there's no clocks on the wall. You don't know what time it is. You can't see the exits. People are bringing you free drinks. We're in a playland. A particular and sort of specific impact is one of the things I think is the most powerful financial sort of driver. It's something called the pain of paying. How when we pay for something, it should cause us, it stimulates the same area of our brain as physical pain. We should pay attention to what's happening and say, wait, is this a good decision? But that's not what humans do. We sort of numb that pain. We don't pay attention to decisions. And the classic tool for that is a credit card. But what's even more powerful is if we get farther and farther away from something we recognize as money, that's what a casino chip is. Not only are we sort of looking at a $5 and seeing just a red round little piece of plastic, but we're in a game environment. It's no longer financial decision making. It's games. It's fun. You got sounds and you got emotion. We are so disconnected from the basic sort of opportunity cost calculation we should make. Should I spend $10 because I have two aces showing and I can split them up? That's not in a dry environment. That's not really even a consideration. That's not good spending. But we're in this place where it doesn't feel like we're spending money. There's no pain of paying. It's gamified and it goes right to our core emotions. Again, it's why people love sale prices. One of the reasons is you go to a store and you find a sale and there's like a little rush of dopamine and you feel like, oh, I did something awesome, and it's become a game. And we talk about JCPenney in the book, and people that go to JCPenney where it's all sales and all coupons, they love the experience of shopping. So if you're in a casino and you're gamified and you get to suddenly feel like, oh, I'm making the right choices, it's just all emotional drivers. I mean, casinos are just, it's like they wrote the book on the book to get people in a heightened emotional state where they're not conscious and they're not thinking about, again, whether it's your values or your big picture or your opportunity costs. They're just kids in a candy store.
So I got to think, and I'm not asking for names and I'm not pointing fingers, but I got to think that Vegas, JCPenney, Kmart, etc., all these places that are designed to get us to part with our money, Vegas especially, where we're not getting us to part with our money for not very good reasons. I guess that can also happen in Kmart and JCPenney, etc. I'm sure these bright business people behind the scenes are hiring some of the brightest behavioral minds on the planet to help them to craft these environments to lure us in. So I have you on the horn right now telling us how we can think about avoiding some of the craft to pull us in. But on the flip side, on the other side, could very well be some of the most prominent academics in the world catching a few extra bucks on the side to offer some of their pearls of wisdom. Am I completely in the conspiracy land?
I think you struck on one of the challenges of the field right now. I mean, look, casinos have been around since way before there was behavioral science as a field. They created the gold watch for retirement long before there was a study into the science of incentives, right? This stuff has sort of already been out there. In particular, as of late, as the field has become more legitimate and recognized and sought after, one of the challenges is the ethical consideration. I come from this perspective, as you might guess from my book, Get Rich Cheating, my otherwise, of like, let's the consumer be aware of what's happening to them and then move forward decisions. There is growing research, and I think people are trying to look at it, about when you nudge unethically. Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize, another leading thinker, he calls it sludge. When you use these sort of traps and biases to get people to places they don't want, that not only is it unethical and something you shouldn't do, but there is a long-term ramification. I mean, if you get someone, let's say, I'm trying to think good as maybe a car dealership, you could convince someone to spend more money than they necessarily need to using these tricks. When that person finds out, our punishment against things that we consider unfair is disproportionately high. So that person's not going to be a return customer. If you're in the business of doing one-offs, sure, you could try to manipulate somebody. But if you want to build a relationship, which I like to think is a better long-term entrepreneurial and business perspective, is like, instead of spending time trying to find new clients, you just service existing clients. If you want to have a relationship, being honest and helping people get to where they want to go is the best thing. People saving for retirement is something that helps the financial advisor because it's more business, but it also helps the client because that's really what they should do for themselves. Over leveraging in order to buy a house that's too big and people don't really need helps the real estate agent and the bank and the mortgage lender, but it doesn't help the person who has to default on their payment down the line. And they're not going to build a relationship and they're not going to build trust. So again, these studies are sort of growing and it becomes more of that, again, that long-term versus immediate thing. But I think you struck something that I'd be interested to hear a lot of people in this field talk about, which is a nerve of what's the right thing to do. And what I have found in my perspective has been, and as I've talked to industry groups as opposed to consumer groups, is like, here are the things that affect people's decisions. But really, if you want to have a good business, the business that lasts aren't the ones that manipulate people constantly. Casinos, you could say, are the exception, but even a casino, there is, you mentioned earlier, it's fun. I mean, those that are able to manage their emotions well, and it's not everyone, there's a value to being in this fun environment, having games. As you can tell, I'm not clear. I'm not super concise on how I answer that, but you have definitely struck a nerve about like, what is the right thing to do? I like to be guided by ethics, but then again, I'm talking to you from the phone, so maybe I'm murdering people as we speak. Who knows?
I hope not. That would be messy, and please clean up if you are. Again, I'm going to go back to watching, I think that's Ozark, something. The book, Dollars and Cents, How We Misthink Money and How to Spend Smarter. Amazon, all the bookstores, all that kind of fun stuff. Is there a website, Jeff, you want to send people to?
Sure. I would do two things. One is peoplescience.com, and also my own site, Jeff Kreisler, KREISLER.com, which then has links to my whole world of work and social media and all that.
Jeff, thanks for taking the time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.